we'll get started here in a minute. Welcome, everybody, to the .NET user group for the month of July. Tonight, we're going to be talking about configuration matrix, presented by Kevin. Obviously, that's some of our things. And today's meetup, as always, is sponsored by Intelitech. That's where we hold the meetup. As always, they're leaders in solution architecture and software design. They're passionate about learning and actively hiring senior developers. Intelitech provides a space, and we're really grateful for that. There's all the links, and these will be in the slides, but here's the links. So, Twitter or X, YouTube, and that's where this link will be posted afterwards. And then kind of going to Spokane Tech, we lead a couple different user groups. So the .NET user group, the Python user group, the DevOps user group, and the Rust user group. And some of our announcements for this month, as always, the Python user group will be meeting later this month. Same with the DevOps. The Rust user group will be announced by Joshua. Not sure yet for the month of July or August, depending on when he holds it. And the .NET user group potentially will be August 6 p.m. That will be tentative right now, but hopefully we'll see you there. And without further ado, don't need to take any more time, pass it over to Kevin. And I'll wait for him to come up.
Thank you. Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Kevin Bost. For those who don't know me, I am a GitKraken ambassador, so you will see some GitKraken tonight because I cannot resist. I am a Microsoft MVP. I do a lot of live streaming, .NET related stuff. If you want all of my links, you can find them there. There is a repo with some code that is up. I kicked it live a little bit earlier. There's a QR code for anybody who wants a fancy link, or you can find it there later. So tonight we're going to be talking about IConfiguration, and this is something that I very much love. It's an area that I spend a lot of time helping people with, pairing with people on, because there is oftentimes it gets used, but not well understood. So people associate this with ASP.NET Core. It doesn't have to be. I'm going to demo with a console app for no other reason other than to prove that you can do this anywhere with anything that you want. And we'll kind of step through and take a look at that. Okay, let's dive in and look at code. There we go. Code, Purdy. Sweet, there we go. Okay, configuration, program CS. So just to pull back the covers a little bit and make sure that it's fairly simple. Obviously, to use configuration, you actually need to pull in a package that has configuration. Conveniently, Microsoft provides this. The Microsoft Extensions configuration package. I'm running Net 8, all the defaults, huzzah, nothing fancy. Okay, so when we start talking about configuration, the whole point is to be able to have something that is configurable, right? If it was something that we could just put in our code and have it be set once, just declare a constant, make a variable, and you're off to the races, right? You don't need configuration. The implicit idea with configuration is that there's something that's worth configuring, something that's worth changing under some conditions, or something that you want to be able to tweak and adjust on the fly, right? The starting point comes from configuration build. Right? This is where we set up all of our things. And the key thing to note here is the builder is where you provide your sources. With configuration, there is a key separation between where you get your information from and then that value itself. Because you may want to provide configuration from, in this case, an in-memory dictionary. But there's other source providers for environment variables, command line arguments, JSON files, et cetera, key vault. And we're going to look at a bunch of them here in a little bit. But in this case, we're just going to set a single variable, or a single source, and a single value within that source. In this case, we're going to call it service URL, because frankly, I was tired, and that was the first variable name that came to mind. We can call it foo if that makes people feel better, but ultimately, service URL because it makes sense, and then I can format it like a URL, and it looks pretty, and everyone's happy, right? From the configuration builder, we call build. So for people who haven't seen this before, this is a very common what's called the builder pattern. You set up a set of settings, you call build to actually create the thing, and then you go ahead and act on it. So in this case, the configuration root is what comes back. We can actually even dial this down to just be IConfiguration, and this is the interface that most people are familiar with seeing. IConfiguration is where you can reach in, look at what's inside of it, and in a lot of ways you can kind of treat it a little bit like a dictionary. Right? You can see I've got an indexer on it here, and I've got a key. Obviously, I've got magic strings all over the place. Wait till we get to like sample 3. That's where the code is actually like in a state where I tell people to use it. This is for learning purposes. We're going to build up to that. But we can just reach in, pull it out, and at the end of the day, if this is all you're doing, don't waste your time with IConfiguration, right? This is real similar to if I just declared a dictionary, right? I've got an in-memory dictionary backing an IConfiguration source so that I can use an indexer to pull a thing back out. Or I could just use a dictionary directly, right? There's not a lot of reason to go back and forth with this. But proof's in the pudding, we run code, and hopefully my terminal launches on this screen and not this screen, and of course it launched on the wrong screen, so whoop. There we go. Look at that. Huzzah. No one's impressed, right? For those people online, there's roaring applause in the room. For those people in the room, pretend like there's roaring applause in the room. There's also laughter at my jokes because that's the way I'm interpreting that. Okay, so we are going to step forward, and we throw away all the stuff. Okay, so let's step forward. Check out this commit. Yay, get cracking. Okay. Okay, moving forward a little bit. So if we look here, the key thing with what Microsoft has done is very much segment things into different NuGet packages. You get to opt into what you want. And for a lot of people, they're used to bringing in and having all these packages immediately available to them. Because if you use the default new project template for like ASP.NET Core, a lot of this stuff comes in as a dependent NuGet. So it's already kind of there. In this case, we're adding to it as we go, and so we're slowly building up. So in this case, we've added in command line arguments because you know what? We might want to actually bring in command line arguments. And you can see here on our configuration builder, we've added one more step. For people who aren't familiar with C# top-level statements, args is a magical keyword inside of a top-level statement, meaning this whole file is effectively my main method. So I can access the command line arguments just by a magical keyword. Right? And if we notice over here on the left, we also have a launch settings. So this is something that I am going to abuse liberally, and if people haven't seen this before, this is an awesome thing to leverage on your projects. A lot of default project templates come with it, but it gives you this ability to have a nice little drop down up here and change what they are. So you'll know I have default, which looks a lot like default. I have other service, which looks a lot like other service. And more importantly, they specify different command line args that are going to be passed into main as I go through and run this. Right? So if we run the basic one with default, and it's just going to keep launching on the wrong monitor. That's exciting, right? So my URL, nothing fun. But if we come back over here, we can hit other service and launch obviously on the other monitor because that's what happens. And now we can see it goes through here. So the important thing to take away from this is the sources that you put into your configuration builder, order matters. Last in wins. These things are effectively layers that just slowly build on top of each other. I remember those picture books I used to have as a kid with the clear pages where you could kind of stack and the picture builds up over time. It's basically like that. If nothing's covering it, you're going to get the thing from the earlier configuration source. Oh. So hold on, we're going to test this. The theory, you just saved me some pain and suffering. I appreciate that. So if you don't close the window like a moron and you hit the play button, it'll just reuse the same instance. And I completely spaced that, and that is wonderful. Cool. Okay, so with all of this, if there are other configuration sources that you want to bring in, it's very simple. Find the appropriate NuGet package. We're going to look at generic host-related stuff here in a minute. And what all that brings in as part of this. But know that I think there's somewhere in the order of like a dozen different built-in configuration sources that Microsoft has out there, and a handful of third-party ones as well. Okay, configuration sources. See, we're going to blaze through these early ones because these are the boring ones. Okay, now let's jump forward yet again. Okay, so once again, we've gone forward a little bit, and we've brought in one more new thing to look at. So now we are going to pull in the configuration JSON one. And this is the one where most people seem to get confused because ASP.NET Core did this and brought in a lot of nice defaults, and people loved it. And they're like, great, if I have an appsettings.json, that just gets picked up and it works. It's like, well, yes, but it's only doing that because that's the default one that was set. You can roll your own, and it's perfectly fine. I've named mine appsettings.json, but there's nothing special about this name. This could be foo.json, and as long as I fix the name in this string, it'll pick up foo.json. And the important thing here to note is this guy is also specified as optional. So if this file is absent, my program goes, oh, okay, that's fine. I'm not looking for that configuration source. If the file's there, great, I'll use it. If it's not, no harm, no foul, we'll move on. And then it also has reload on change, meaning this configuration source, if we edit the file, and we'll go and prove this here in a moment, it's going to actually pick up that change. Now, oftentimes when we're deploying out to our servers, we don't have the ability to just edit a JSON file locally. However, in some cases you do. Right? There are some situations where maybe you're bringing in a file through a mount, like in Kubernetes, and maybe there is a chance that that file is changing out from under you, and having that reload is an option. Right? There's also a key by file situation in a lot of AKS or Kubernetes environments that's also useful for the same thing because you might be swapping those things in, and maybe there is a chance for those to change. You also note the in-memory collection and the command line args. So let's fire this guy up. I just want to check my launch settings and remember what I did. Good, I kept them the same. Remember what you did. Okay, so you'll note service URL, escape to exit, but if I hit enter, if I actually type in here, right, it loads this. But if we take a little at our output directory, which I did not keep open because that would have made complete sense. I'm just going to grab that guy here real quick, and we're going to back up. If we go and look at our output directory, no, so you'll note it's grabbing the one from the output directory, not from the project directory. That's important to note, because if you edit the one in your project directory, you're not going to see a change until you recompile, because then it's copying the new file out.
And if you forget to include the file in the output, you'll figure out why your configuration's not working because it's not reading it.
Exactly. Yeah, the comment was if you forget to include your file in the output, you then get very confused why it's not there. So specifically in the CS proj, that is the reason for this copy to output directory. Wow, reading is hard. That means I don't have enough Mountain Dew in my system yet. At least I'm pretty sure that's how I interpret that. Okay, let's grab VS Code since, nope, VS Code, come here. Don't do weird things to me. Okay, so if we come in here and do lots of changes, because that's what we do, and we save those changes, because if you don't save the changes, you also look dumb. Then you press enter, huzzah! There's your magical reload on change. This is one of the coolest things about all of this, is we don't have to build this kind of information anymore, right? Most of the configuration stuff that we're going to end up doing is probably in the box. And on all of these configuration sources, if you want to build your own, you can. There's probably one out there if you've thought of an interesting situation. I was going to go through and build a sample of saying, you know what, it'd be really cool to store all my settings in SQLite. Right? I'm going to have a table. It'll be a key value store. It'll be really slick. And then I opened up the Microsoft Docs page to the custom provider. And you know what the sample was? A SQLite provider with a table and a key value store. And I went, dang nabbit. I was very excited thinking I'd come up with a really cool idea. And it turns out Microsoft had the idea long before I did, which was really, really disappointing because I thought it was a good one. OK. So, I probably should have mentioned before, feel free, questions in the room, or if there's questions on chat, Dan has very graciously been monitoring chat, and I'm sure he is appropriately going to relay all questions. So feel free to shoot them whenever. I am happy to answer versus waiting till the end or similar. So, but that is there and building appsettings.json. OK. Let's keep going forward. We get into more inch. Let's get to something slightly more interesting. So now we're getting, this is the point where things are actually useful. So for those people who are wondering when they can start using this code in their applications, we have now reached the point where we're at a usable state. Right? The other stuff was, and that's what happens with Visual Studio features crash. See this little preview symbol? When you run the preview, things sometimes go kaboom. That's very exciting. OK, so configuration is great. But at the end of the day, just being able to pull things out of what looks to kind of be a dictionary isn't really that exciting. Nobody cares that much about reading out of a dictionary. We already had a dictionary. We don't need extra layers of abstraction to be able to do that. The I options builds on top of the I configuration. Again, Microsoft likes to layer all of this stuff together. And it gives you a way of having good separation of concerns. Because we want to separate away the source of our configuration variables, the provider of that source, and then the code that actually is going to be using those configuration variables. And with things like I options, it now brings us into a state where we can go, OK, if I have an options class, now I've got something that I can compile against. When there's a change, I've got one thing that matters. And the code that's using it doesn't need to know about my configuration provider, right? We'll see dependency injection and that stuff in a moment. But being able to have all of those things brought apart and have that separation of concerns is very important. It lets us break apart things like validation, because we want to be able to validate on these things and make sure it's correct. But we don't want our code thinking about that. Like in this case, we are configuring our service URL. So we can hypothesize we're building an app that needs to talk to some service. Great. We've only built a couple of those in our lifetimes, I'm sure, most of us. But when we get around to actually pulling that out, the code shouldn't really need to know anything more than, here's the URL I want you to go to. Right? It doesn't need to know about maybe all the other configuration settings. It only needs that one. And so having things broken apart into those relevant sections. So you can see on my in-memory collection here, I've done this separation with a colon. Right? Before, we were just doing service URL. And now we've got web services colon service URL. And then if we look down at the code that's actually using it, we can see that it's pulling out this web services class thing, which is just a very simple C# record class. So for the people who haven't heard it before, POCO, plain old C# object. This is just a C# class with a single property on it called service URL. And I have very intentionally not cased these things the same to make a point that case doesn't matter. Right? You should probably case them the same in your code for sanity reasons, because otherwise things look weird. But it's not case sensitive. We still have all of our same stuff in terms of our sources. We're still pulling in our appsettings.json, huzzah. We still pull in command line arguments, huzzah. But now on our I configuration, rather than going at it like a regular dictionary and using the indexer, we're going to pull out a section. And so if you think of configuration like a JSON file, because JSON files show hierarchy a little better than like command line arguments or similar, right? Your section is a JSON object, right? And then there's properties inside of it. We can nest these deeper if we want, but in this case, we're just going to go one level down. Other levels look exactly the same. You add more curly braces. Very fun. In this case, we have the web services object and this service URL. Perfect. When we pull this out using the section, that grabs our top level objects, and then the get method says, okay, I'm going to reach inside and I'm going to populate that object and set all of the properties on it. This then gives us back a web services thing that we can now act on and say, oh, okay, here's the service URL. Now, you know, there's no validation here. This guy came through as nullable, which isn't great because, you know, maybe it's not there because it's very possible that none of your configuration sources specify a web services section. There is no value to populate. What would it provide, right? So you get back null or empty depending on how empty your JSON file is. And then that means we end up null checking it here, but we do get our service URL. So if we run this guy here, we can see that we pulled back, and we pulled back from json.com. Right? So it's not our in-memory collection. It's coming from our appsettings.json. And if we look at our launch settings one, we can see that we've got this guy in here, and we can see service URL is set like this. So if we were to say other service and run it, you see, once again, we still didn't get our value. And this is one of those problems because we don't necessarily have assurances that the key that was specified matches. So our IConfiguration instance actually has a web services section that contains a service URL. And then it also has a top-level value for service URL. Those are not matching. If we were to come over here and say, well, OK, maybe rather than just doing service URL, we want to specify web service URL. Dang it. I'm trying to remember. Now I'm trying to remember. Does anyone remember this key separator? Should have wrote this down.
Do they do double dash like key vault?
Like that? It's possible. No. There's the key separator. And there's limitations once you get into command line arguments as far as what can be specified. I may have to pull open the docs and look at that. The point, though, that I was poorly attempting to make is that to represent hierarchy in a configuration source that doesn't really have hierarchy, you end up having to do special syntax. And it does depend on the source provider as far as what that's going to be. Right? The comment in the room was key vault uses the double hyphen to denote hierarchy. Environment variables, I believe you can get away with either colon or double underscore. I say either because one of them doesn't work under certain operating systems, which is why there's two different separators, and I don't remember which way it goes. So you will oftentimes see like the double underscore on the environment variable ones when those get populated as well to be able to specify those. But at least with this, we've now moved beyond just dictionaries and strings to something that actually is strongly typed. Something that if I were to go through and change the property on service URL to be different, right? I now get a compile error. So if I'm going to go through and start changing my configuration values, I no longer have to do a text-based search through my code base to try to find everywhere where service URL is. I now have compile time checking. The other thing that's important to note, you'll note I didn't make this property here a string. I made this a URI, right? Just because the value that's coming in is coming in as a string doesn't mean the target has to be a string. You could kind of imagine working with like any of the JSON serializer, Newtonsoft, systemtext.json. There's the type converters that allow you to go in to well-known types when possible to be able to put those through. Ints, doubles, et cetera, right? We can parse those things through. URIs, parsable. GUIDs, parsable. Those types of things that there's built-in converters for, you can now go from just a string to something that you can actually guarantee actually matches some sort of parsing that comes all the way out. Right? It's also a way to have it fail when your configuration source doesn't match. But that's a problem for a future example. It is supposed to be double underscore. And why didn't that work? Did I just not hit? Oh, maybe I didn't hit save. That would be dumb. So web services, I'm not being an idiot, right? Okay, I'm going to copy and paste because I don't want to be an idiot. Or at least don't want to be. Interesting. I might have to play with that. Apparently docs say double underscore is supposed to be the separator for it, and we are still getting this one.
Do you use equal sign when you're doing that? I don't know.
Yeah, there is potentially an issue with escaping the values here, because this is a string inside a JSON file that's going to be passed as a command line argument on process.start in a moment. So sometimes what you end up specifying on these command line arguments, you have to do like fun escaping gymnastics with, which makes it a little weird. Okay, Kraken, do your thing. Throw those away. Let's jump forward. Check out this commit. Oh, Kraken, you are so wonderful. I love you. Okay, so now we're going to go and dive off the deep end. Because at a certain point with configuration, like we can do those builders, we can build things up, but it only gets us so far in the magical hierarchy of what we're doing. Now, most of us are going to be working in a project that probably has dependency injection turned on. It's kind of normal in a lot of .NET projects at this point. So normal, in fact, Microsoft released a generic host. Most people think of the generic host as, oh, that's the way I set up a project in ASP.NET Core. True, but that's because it's using a host pattern that they then genericized and took out all the ASP.NET bits and was like, you can use this on anything. And it gives you a lot of cool stuff. Configuration, dependency injection, logging, all of that stuff kind of just comes baked in the box. And so a lot of those defaults that people assume are, the normal ones that just magic occurs. No, there's no magic here. The generic host, they just said, these are the defaults we're going to put in this method. You can change them, but they're the defaults, so that's what everybody's familiar with. So once again, when we say create default builder, right, this guy here, oh, that's exciting. Apparently when I zoom in while screen sharing, I lose my monitor. That is wonderfully exciting. So we're going to go here, and I'm going to try one more thing. If I do that, yes. OK, got it. So the key thing to note here is we've got all of these default configuration bits set up. And this is what people are fairly familiar with in understanding how normal projects work, right? And the only reason these work is because the IConfiguration source builder that's inside of this is set up with these sources, with these defaults ready to go. Right? Just like we were doing in the prior example, that's something similar inside of the generic host. No magic is happening here. It's all stuff we could configure at the same thing that we wanted. So they bring in environment variables, but they bring in the ones that have .NET underscore with the prefix. Right? The appsettings.json. Oh, great. That's the base level one. And again, appsettings.json comes first because order matters here, right? Because the way that these things get brought in is the order of precedence under where they're going to overwrite or cover up one another. Right? We then have appsettings.environment variable or environment.json. The user secrets if the environment happens to be development, because people might want to use user secrets. User secrets are great. For those people who haven't seen them, they're just a JSON file that's not inside your repository. That's it. They're no more magical than that. There's a little GUID that tells it what the file path should be, and they're stored off in your user profile. But the whole point is it's a JSON file with first-party tooling support that's just not in your repository, so it doesn't get checked in. Right? If you're worried about a text file that contains a secret on your system, yeah, it's a text file that contains a secret that's on your system, but it's not in source control. So oftentimes people will see user secrets and think, well, only user secrets go there. Well, yes, but you can also leverage it for configuration that you don't want checked in. Right? So if I want to go through and tweak a service URL, but I only want it to apply to me, and I don't want to accidentally check it in, I can go to my usersecrets.json, add that value, and override something that's in app settings, and know that I don't have to worry about accidentally checking it in. I also then get confused 2 weeks later when I forget that I've done that, and then I can't figure out why my local environment isn't working. So, that's always a fun problem to solve. But that's a self-inflicted wound. Don't do that. Once you've done it, undo it. Or similar. Same thing with like environment variables. You can then set up environment variables on your local system and avoid affecting everybody else. Have it just be yours. Or we can abuse our launch settings here in a moment. Right? So for generic host, everything starts with your host, create default builder. And then inside of here, it's worth noting, you actually have 2 IConfiguration instances that you can play with. Right? There's the host configuration, which is how are we going to configure our host. Right? Think of this more infrastructure-y related. And then we get down to application level configuration. This is configuration for my code, my application. Right? So you'll see people do both, but just understand that there is that separation between the configuration instance used for the host and the one that's used for your app. Most of the time, you're going to be playing with app configuration. And in this case, just for symmetry, I've added in the same in-memory collection, but there's a subtle change that's happened here. In my prior examples, my in-memory collection was added first. In this case, I'm adding it here, which is being added after the generic host has set up its defaults. So in this case, my in-memory collection is being added on the back end of things and is going to potentially cause us a little bit of problems. But we'll see that in a moment. And then finally, we're going to go down to configure services. And this was the whole reason of bringing in the generic host is we need dependency injection. Because what we would really like to do is rather than having to use that IConfiguration instance every time and pull our configuration back out, we would really like to just dependency inject in the bits of configuration we care about. Because when you hand that IConfiguration interface around, you're handing all the configuration around. The code that's using it could access anything it wants, which 1, might just be a problem because that's too much, and 2, it makes a refactoring nightmare. Because then when you want to change configuration, go, well, is this value used anywhere? You have to hunt every single instance of that. It's like, no, what I really want to do is I want to not, still call this service URL. I'd like to call it something different. But now I have to try to figure out who's actually going into my IConfiguration and pulling that back out. Who's actually pulling out the web services thing? Not as bad as a full text-based search because at least I can hunt it by class, but it's still kind of obnoxious. Once we get down to IOptions, we now have a slightly cleaner way of being able to do this. Right? So you'll note I still have my web services class, but I've switched it from a positional record to a non-positional record. And the only reason for doing that is IOptions requires its generic type here to have a default constructor, so no parameters. And when you do a positional record class, you get a constructor. And we could go through and add an optional constructor with no parameters and then forward in and yuck. That was typing, and this was not a lot of typing. That's happening. Validate on data annotations and validate on start. So this means validate on start says that when my host starts up, we're going to actually validate our options. Now, we haven't actually called host.start, so that's kind of meaningless at the moment. But it will validate when we say, OK, get required service. Because at that point, it's saying, I'm about to go and instantiate one of these things. I actually need to validate what's there. And then the validate data annotations, we have data annotations sitting on top of this, right? Required data annotations saying, I expect that there needs to be a service URL populated in my configuration somewhere, or this app won't work, right? This app needs to be able to call this downstream service. Up to you what's required and what's not. A lot of times if you've got maybe a service that relies on a downstream service, probably should be required to have a value in your configuration, right? There may be some debate about, well, what if it's only missing 1 of 3? Well, that's up to you and your app of what's actually required. Right? But the key thing here is now we've actually separated out and we can pull out an IOptions interface. Let me check our launch settings real quick and see where we're at. We've got a bunch of them in here. Let's go back to default for just a moment, just so we can prove a point. So let's launch this guy. And we're going to stop. OK, so a key thing here with IConfiguration, and especially being able to debug, because one of the most frustrating things is you are working with configuration, and like we saw in a sample a minute ago, I set it up, I don't get the value I want. Why am I not getting my configuration value? I clearly set it on my command line. Why is double underscore not working, hypothetically, right? These are the problems that we all run into every day. If you go through and look at this callback, you'll see that there's your configuration builder. And if we dive into it, we can see the sources. This is also an easy way when you forget what the defaults are for the generic host, or you want to see them, you can always just grab a hold of this guy and take a look and see your sources. It also helps if you reference a library that maybe adds additional sources or removes ones or reorders them, right? You can go through and look at these sources and know that they are going to be evaluated, right, in order. We've got this JSON configuration source, which should be appsettings.json. We've got this one down here, appsettings.production.json, right? We didn't set an environment in our launch settings, so it went, well, I default to production, right? Because in the absence of you telling me anything else, I'm going to assume that this is a production running app. I don't want to accidentally deploy development into prod, so I fall back to prod by default, right? Some people don't like that. Some people like the inverse. That feels weird to me. And then the environment variables as well. And you'll note here, once we go through and add in the in-memory collection, the unfortunate part is what's going to happen is in memory, the memory configuration source is now last. Right? It's the top page of our book that we're now looking through, which means it's going to win on everything. Useful? Maybe not. However, this sort of setup is absolute gold when it comes to testing ASP.NET Core. Because for people who haven't seen it, Web Application Factory is a nice way of standing up an in-memory instance of a web API, for example, and then being able to pound on it with tests. And when you stand up a Web Application Factory, you get access to being able to do this type of configuration. So it's quite common in those tests to say, you know what, I actually want to apply some configuration, and I want it to come in after the defaults, because when I'm running these tests, you know what, I don't want to actually go to my auth 0 endpoint, right? I want to circumvent some of that, right? Let's reconfigure that over to this test instance, because it's like I want to run kind of in production, but not really. I want to be similar, especially for like integration tests. Maybe I reroute a database to something different. Great, right? These types of things being able to come in behind the scenes with like an in-memory collection are perfect, right? That is what those are used for. And then if we let the guy ride, look at that, myurl.com, which is exactly where this guy is coming from. Now, if we turn this thing off and get rid of that so that we stop referencing it, now we come in and we can see we fall back to our appsettings.json, right? From json.com, huzzah. So let's take a look at our launch settings.json here. Now, inside of here, you'll remember that it showed appsettings.environment.json. This is something I often see people having questions on because they see the default ASP.NET Core template, they see app settings, and then nested under it, there's this development.json and production.json. Because I don't have that SDK referenced, because I'm just, again, a standard console app, nothing fancy, my files aren't nested. Right? In Visual Studio and the Solution Explorers, there's magic you can do with MS Build to nest files under other files. And most people are like, well, that's weird. You know, folders contain files. Files don't contain files. Yeah, it's kind of a lie. In Solution Explorer, you can nest anything under anything else. Weird, but you can do it. And for the purposes of like appsettings.json, it kind of makes sense. Right? I'm going to have my base level one up here, and I'm going to put my environment ones nested under it, and that's what the default configuration on that SDK does. It's not here now, so we get flat files, which I think makes more sense. But if we want to go through and configure our environment, we can set this up. And I also went through and set up this other service one to have a .NET environment of custom. Right? Just to hammer home the idea of these environment names, there is nothing magical about them. They are just strings. The fact that we have one named production and one named development, those just happen to be what Microsoft said, this is common. We know people have prod. We know people have development. Let's go ahead and put those in as the defaults. Great. That's fine. You may have something called custom. You may have something called, hypothetically, unit tests. Maybe, right? Some people may have worked on projects with me where I've done exactly that. So they are probably lamenting and going, oh, why did he do this? Yes, that's why. So let's go through and, so what did I put inside of custom? Right, custom service URL. So if we launch this guy, just proof is in the pudding. If we flip over, yay, look at that. Now we're actually loading in the correct file because our environment has now successfully changed. Again, this launch settings.json file, I don't think people appreciate how awesome this is. It also does work from the command line. So people who aren't in Visual Studio going, oh, I don't like this, this Visual Studio feature. No, no, no. You can do it on .NET Run on the command line. There is a launch profile name. Just fire it off, right? It works everywhere. Everywhere where there's a terminal, which is everywhere. Because if you can't start a process, how are you running in the first place? OK, let's come over here. Just want to make sure I'm not missing anything exciting inside of this. Let's see. Web settings, blah, blah. Development.json. I think we're good. I think we're good. Oh, validation. Right. So let's show the validation actually working then real quick. So hypothetically, if we flip ourselves back to stop. Right? So let's go back. We're going to go to environment variables empty on default so that we don't have one. Then we're going to go to our app settings. We're just going to whack this sucker so he doesn't exist. So I am now in a situation where none of my configuration sources should be providing me anything. Good. Okay. So if we launch right on the line where we pull that guy back out, data annotations validation failed. Web service member service URL with error. The service URL field is required. Huzzah, right? This type of validation is perfect. I see people oftentimes taking in an options class inside of a service or a controller or whatever, and then they validate the values on it. Please don't. Right? Like, unless you have a reason why it's like, well, I only want validation in this case, and it needs to be conditional, and yada, 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 right? And there's reasons to set it up that way. Most of the time, people are like, I want to make sure that a value got populated on my options class. Great, right? Set up validation. Have it either validate on start or have it validate at the point it accesses here. Because validate on start is an opt-in feature simply because it does technically impact your startup time, right? It's probably negligible in most people's use cases, but it does impact startup time because now it has to actually do those checks. But if you were going to do those checks, why, right? Stop it. The system's here. It's one line of code. Leverage this system because all of those common cases are built for you. And here in a moment, we will look at advanced stuff. But yes, validation works. Huzzah. Again, the reason validate on start doesn't necessarily trigger is because I am not calling host.start. Right? If the host doesn't start, there is no starting point to validate on. So this is kind of just here as an example, we'll say. But if you are inside of an ASP.NET Core project, it's going to have that host. It's going to call start. You'll see it in your main method. It's very exciting. And that's where your breakpoint or your debugger will then stop on you. OK, throw you away, throw you away. OK. Check out this commit. Oh, look at that. Thank you, GitKraken. You were wonderful. OK, so a couple things here. So one, we were looking at validation, and you can see the red squiggle line. And it'll take it a moment to figure out that the red squiggle is meaningless. But at some point, Visual Studio will rearrange itself. Hang on, I think if I build, it'll kick it faster. There, you'll note, build succeeded. Yeah, there, get the red squiggles out of here. So if you would like to put together custom validation on your options, because for whatever reason, there's something special you need to do, right? There's some sort of condition back and forth. You want to add special validation. The iValidate options interface is typically the way you will go about doing this. You create a class. You implement iValidate options. And this is a very simple interface. We go look at this guy. Right? It has validate. Not rocket science, right? And this name is optional. We'll see named options in a moment. But most of the time, what you're going to do is just act on your second parameter and say, hey, here's my options instance. Am I valid? Right? Very simple. But you'll note here, I was really lazy. Like writing validation code sounded like work and typing and all that kind of stuff. And I'm a .NET dev, and I'm allergic to that. So if we take a look up here, dependency analyzers, little bigger, options generators, you'll note I've got this wonderfully source gen file, and this is ugly, and you don't need to read it. The important thing to note here, this little attribute up here, this options validator, there is built-in source generator support to generate the validators for you. So rather than doing the inspection of your POCO, in this case our web services class, and seeing, oh, okay, the required attributes there, right? Normally that would take reflection at runtime. I pull the properties, I get the attribute of the property, I then go and check it, yada, 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 right? That takes runtime hits. But the presence of that attribute isn't going to change between compile time and runtime. So we can source gen that validation, and then we don't need to worry about doing the validation at runtime. We can do it at compile time and shift that across. Right? So the options validator brings this thing across. And then typically, what we'll end up doing is registering up the validator in our service collection so that DI then knows that it exists. Because inside of your DI container, it will rip through everything that's registered that implements iValidate options and go, ah, I have an options class, I have a validator, I run these things at the appropriate time. Because that is what matters. You'll note the other thing that we've subtly changed in here is we are no longer using iOptions. We are using iOptions monitor. Because iOptions is really great when you want to pull out and have that option, and that is all it will be. Right? You can imagine making yourself a static version of it or similar. The problem is sometimes you have sources that may change. You might have a configuration source that's key vault, for example. And you might want to go back to that key vault and say, I don't really like having to restart my app every time I update the secret in key vault. I want you to reread that value every single time and pull that back. And every single time is a little bit of a loose statement, right? So iOptions monitor pulls that back and says, OK, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leverage an internal cache, and I'm going to then update as there are changes coming through, because I want to be able to see this. The same as what we saw with our JSON file, where we updated the JSON file and then new value came through. That's great, except for that was working because we re-reached into IConfiguration and pulled the value back out. Right? We don't always want to reach in to IConfiguration and pull it back out, because every time you do that, it has to rip through all of the sources and figure out what the values are. It'd be really nice if we had the one thing and say, I just want this little section of my configuration, pull that back out for me. Right? So that's what iOptions monitor ends up giving you. There is also an iOptions snapshot, which is slightly different. So unlike iOptions, which is effectively a singleton or a static or similar, right? iOptions pulls it back on every resolution. So you can think of in like ASP.NET Core, most things are registered scoped. If you had a controller that took in an iOptions snapshot, every request, it would go back and pull it back rather than it being once. Right? So it depends on where do you want to be in that hierarchy of how much do I care about having an updated value versus how much do I just want fast resolution. Right? So iOptions is kind of like your singleton. iOptions snapshot is, I don't want to say scoped, but it's kind of the middle ground. And then iOptions monitor is, no, we're gonna go back and reread this. Right? We want the updated value, which is why down here, rather than being .value, it's .current value now. Right? That current value is what says, OK, go and give me the new updated value, bring it back, let's display the URL. That's what we actually care about. This on the last one, I forgot. When registering up the options, we actually go through and tell it what is the section name that we do this. Typically with our configurations, things are broken into sections. My starting example, we had service URL at the top level. Most of the time, you don't put things at the top level. Usually, they're down one level and in logical groups. Right? What those logical groups are kind of depends on you. Do I want to have something that says, well, this is all my web services, or maybe I want to break it apart and go, OK, these are all my auth configurations. Right? A lot of things go together, client ID, client secret, et cetera. Those types of things. Like, OK, well, maybe I put those things grouped together based upon usage. And just like interface segregation principle of, where do we separate versus where do we bring together, it depends on how you're using it, as far as where you put it. Okay. Checking to make sure, did I miss anything on that one? Options monitor. Oh, environment variable. See, this is why I left myself notes. So, this problem is I close this guy. So, this guy up here. So, for the environment variables, if we go here, all right, so before we had the .NET environment that controls which of our appsettings.json was coming through. If we look at appsettings.development, we can see my development url.com is specified, but we can also see that we're setting an environment variable, web services _ service URL. Like I said, I believe colon also works, but there's a condition under which colon doesn't work, and I think it's operating system based. Check docs. I can't remember off the top of my head. But if we go through and run this guy, and we remember to change, because if you don't launch with the launch profile that you expect, you don't get the right value. But we can see service URL is our environment variable based one, because environment variables come in later in the configuration process than the appsettings.json and override them. So if you want to have it, and again, you can set up environment variables inside of your system, or you can set them up in your launch settings.json. I like launch settings.json. I also prefer to check them in so that the entire team gains the benefit of them, but there are pros and cons to it, right? Usually user secrets.json is where I like to put developer-specific config. OK. You go there, you go there. And you know what? We'll just double-click main at this point. So if anybody goes to the repo, you'll note it's a very linear history. Just grab the commit if you want to see. Or if you just want to see the ending state, just pull main. OK, so a couple more things that are worth highlighting. So for iOptions, there are ways to be able to go through and do configuration of your options, because sometimes it comes from a configuration source, and sometimes you just need to run some code. Right? I have to look something up. I have to do some math. I have to do whatever. Right? If it's on a Monday, I tack a 1 on the end of my URL. Or in this case, I'm going to tack a 42 on the end of my URL because 42 is the correct number to pick. Right? So there are methods underneath the add options. This guy returns back another options builder. Again, that same pattern for configuration builder that we used at the beginning. Add options does the same thing. It gives you back a builder, lets you do things to the builder. At the end of the day, it's going to then build up the options that it gives back. There is also a configure method and a post configure method. One's at the beginning, one's at the end. You can probably guess which one's which. Post goes at the end. Right? So in this case, we're using post configure because we want to grab the currently configured value, and we're going to reach into our services and call get value. You'll note this post configure has some magic. Same with configure. They both take up to 5 generic parameters, and it will DI resolve those parameters for you. So you can just make these things up. Right? And as long as the DI container knows what those things are, it's happy to provide them for you. So if you need to reach across to another service to get some options to do some configuration, great. Those things are there. You know, this my cool config services, which is definitely a very cool config service because it just returns 42, which makes it immediately the best thing ever. This guy is DI registered. And then I just added it here, right? Just because IConfiguration is technically also being pulled out of the DI container. But people see IConfiguration, they're like, oh, that's just one of the built-in types. It just knows how to handle the built-in type. No, no, no. It can do anything you register. So regardless, up to 5, have fun. If you need more than 5, you make a service, you put all the things in the service that you need, and you register just it. And you're off to the races. Right? The other thing down here is, you'll note I've also gone through and created 2 sections. Right? So I've got other section name and web services. So imagine you're in a situation where maybe you've got multiple regions, right? I'm setting up the same set of services. I've got my East region. I've got my West region. And based upon that, like they're supposed to look the same. You know, I've done my infrastructure as code. I've got everything set up. But obviously, the URLs would need to point slightly differently. I don't want to separate a second POCO C# object for each region. They're going to be identical, but I need to configure them differently, right? Something of that nature. We can go through and actually set up 2 different sections, one for our web services and one for our other services. Again, think East region, West region, whatever, and be able to pull those things back. If we go back here, right, we can see we have web services here, other services here, and we're deserializing into the same POCO iOptions object. Great. So their structure needs to match. But we can register them by name, right? So when we were looking at that validation interface where it had a nullable string, some things can be registered with a name, some things may not be. So for example, 26, there's no name registered. 36 does register with a name. Then down below, when we want to use it, we have to actually be a little explicit, right? So when we pull out our iOptions monitor, same thing we were using before, rather than just doing .currentValue and saying just give me the default one, we have to say, no, actually, I want the one with this other name, right? Because at some point, something in your code is going to have to make a decision. Am I going to West region? Am I going to East region? How do I get that name? That's up to you. Pass it around. More config, right? Config of config. That sounds great, regardless of being able to do it. But it does give you a nice, simple way of being able to reach across and pull back that information in any sort of named options class. Let me see. Sample configuration with DI. Did I hit all my points? Yes, yes, yes. I think that's there. So, questions, comments?
So on that last one with the named options, like what we've done is if we've got something where it's the same configuration, but we have like 5 different instances, we just inherit from the base one, and then we use the name of the other one so we can inject it in and it always gets the version it needs.
Okay. So the comment there being that 5 separate instances, but there's a common base POCO that you're leveraging for most of them, and then derived classes.
Yeah, the derived class name is just basically what our named thing is, so that's what it injects, but they've all got the same shape.
Got it. Okay. So yeah, so leveraging the fact that different derived classes then provide the distinction between each of them, which definitely works, right? Perfectly fine to go through to it. It really just depends on, do people want to declare a derived class every time they want a separate one? Maybe, right? Because you either pass around that derived class type into each of them, great, that works, or you end up having to pass effectively the string through for whatever you need. So, but again, both options, perfectly fine. I think as long as it's working, that's what's important. Shipping's the most important feature for any app. You must have it, or I don't care what you built. Because until you ship, it doesn't matter. Dan, do we have anything online?
No questions?
Perfect. I'm going to assume that means everything was perfectly clear. It was wonderful. Do I go back to the slide? I'm going to pause for a moment and give people a quick second. Let me just pop that guy real quick. As always, if people have follow-up questions, feel free to reach out. We've got, if you're watching this after live on YouTube, hi YouTube, feel free to leave questions in the comments. We will follow up as we can, or you can always reach out. A lot of the information for Intelitech is just intelitech.com or Spokane.net user group stuff. Do be looking for more talks that are coming. Especially as we get close to the end of the year in November. There's a new version of C# every time because that's the cadence we roll out as .NET is every year. Let's do a new version. That'll be great. So that's always exciting. Either end of the year, first of the following one, kind of going through what is new in C# because there's always new, cool, exciting stuff. Sweet. Dan's giving me a thumbs up. If people want a fun, exciting thing, check out their Microsoft build was last month. The month just changed and I'm doing date math in my head. There's a very good talk from Mads and Dustin on what's coming in next version of C#. Highly recommend it. But be aware, everything they show is like preview bits subject to change. I think there's already been changes from what they showed, of course, because why not? So don't get too attached to what you see. You'll get some version of that in November-ish. Some of it's there, some of it's like, we just compiled this last night. Let's show it off. It compiles, we can ship that, right? So, perfect. With that, tell everybody thank you for coming. Really appreciate it. See everyone next month. We still live, Dan? Do I get to keep talking? I was going to say, I can keep talking.